ASPPH Presents Webinar, the Council on Linkages Revised Core Competencies for Public Health Professionals Applying the Core Competencies, sponsored by ASPPH in collaboration with the Public Health Foundation. I am Sarah Weiner, Program Manager for Education and Practice, and I'm joined today by several of my ASPPH colleagues. Today's webinar will feature Kathleen Amos of the Public Health Foundation, Jennifer Coker of Drexel University's School of Public Health, Dr. Kathleen Miner of Emory University Rollins School of Public Health, and Dr. Marita Merman of Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. This webinar is the fifth of the 2014-2015 ASPPH Presents series, which has been designed as a service to SEEP-accredited ASPPH member schools and programs of public health. A few housekeeping items of note. Due to the nature of this presentation format, there may be a slight delay in the advancement of presentation slides. Additionally, while you are in listen-only mode and your lines have been muted, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the question box. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Please be sure to refrain from placing your line on hold during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the ASPPH website soon. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for 1 hour of CPH continuing education credit. During today's webinar, the speakers will first provide a description of a competency and will then provide an overview of the 2014 version of the core competencies, how these changes address feedback from the public health community, and resources and tools available to support the use of the competencies. In addition, our speakers will describe how they use competencies in developing curricula for education in public health and external trainings for the public health workforce, and will provide examples of their use. Additionally, they will provide an overview of how competencies relate to practice-based and academic-based accreditation. At the conclusion of the presentations, we will have time for questions from the audience. I'll now turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Kathleen Miner.
Thank you, Sarah. What I'd like to do is open up a discussion about the wonderful world of competencies and their utility for work in both the academic setting and for the practice setting. What I'd like to start off with is a discussion of how useful competencies are and where you might find them. First, you might notice that they're useful in organizations, and where you find them in organizations is they help define things like vision statements in organizations. We also set things like policy priorities and the scope of practice within an organization. They also are useful in job descriptions and job functions of the personnel within an organization. And for the academic setting, what they do is they help define degree programs, areas of practice within that program, course descriptions, syllabi, and the assessment of student performance and test development. And you also might find that good competency statements have some structure to them. And if you take a look at this sort of structural design here, that a competency, particularly for instructional design or training design, would have a single verb that describes an action with a content about what that action describes. And given that, then that would help, for example, to design something like an instructional experience within a class or even within an area of training that would then lead to a measure that would determine whether or not that individual was actually doing that, whether it's on the job or in a classroom setting. And based on that, you would have some performance feedback that would decide whether that instructional experience or that work experience is actually taking place. And that could also influence, for example, job descriptions or performance things happening on the job. And if you want some more information about how that might look, let's see the next slide. If you were thinking about a single competency statement, each statement may only have one verb. If you have multiple verbs in a competency statement, what you really are doing is having a single competency turned into multiple competencies. Because if you have multiple things to do, you might actually find out that you're confusing either the learner or the worker. Another example for thing that you might want to think about a competency, each competency statement needs a verb that is measurable. If it's not measurable, then the person who's trying to perform it might be confused. A verb like understand cannot be measured because understanding to one person is not the same understanding to another person. Another example, for example, that you might want to think about, a verb can be found, if you're confused about that, in kind of lists that are available. In a world like education, there are things like Bloom's taxonomy. There are other kinds of lists like affective domain. These are the kind of domains, if you think about appreciation or things that they value. For example, you might care about a worker that appreciates their job, and you may care about that. Other people don't really particularly care whether they like their job, you just want them to do it. You might also find some of these verbs in practice or professional things like ASPPH or the Council on Linkages that you'll hear about in just a few minutes. And then some places in particular kinds of jobs, they have their own vocabularies that they want people to have, and you might find that some of those verbs are associated with medicine, mathematics, or pharmacy and things like that. But whatever it is, the verb should reflect expected level of mastery for the learner performing the content within that statement associated with the competency. So those verbs are really important, and they need to reflect the exact performance that you expect of the learner and or the person who is doing the work that you expect to take place. Next slide. The other thing that's important about a competency statement that you really need to be careful of, you don't want to sneak in hidden modifiers such as adequate, appropriate, or suitable, or things like that. These adjectives such that I've just mentioned imply standards that are subjective. If, for example, if you are doing things that you're teaching somebody, you would never teach them to do things that are inadequate or inappropriate or not suitable, but when you put them in a competency, they're in there to be kind of fuzzy, and it can be confusing to the learner or, in fact, even to an employer who's trying, or employee who's trying to do a suitable job in the workplace, because these standards are not something to one person or another. However, if there are standards to be met, they need to be widely agreed upon, things like JCO or CEPH or the FAB requirements. From an instructor perspective, we do not want to be held accountable to perform a competency inadequately, no matter where you do that. The last one I want to mention, because it's going to come up in just a minute, if there are competency domains to be met or to follow, the domain should be pure, and each competency should be listed in only one domain framework. Each domain needs to be able to stand on its own, and so if you're trying to set up an array of things for workers and or for educational situations, you don't want to have competencies mixed all over a domain framework. And I think this is really important, as you will hear from the next speaker, and I like to introduce Kathleen Amos, who will give you an array of competencies. So Kathleen, it's up to you.
Kathleen, make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Sarah?
Yep, you sound good. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yes, so thank you very much, Kathy. And as mentioned, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the core competencies for public health professionals, focusing on the 2014 version. So to begin, the core competencies are developed by the Council on Linkages between academia and public health practice, which is a collaborative of 20 national organizations engaged in public health. It includes ASPPH, and it aims to improve public health practice, education, and research, focusing a lot on areas of workforce development within public health. The Council on Linkages is funded by CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Public Health Foundation provides staff support. The core competencies are a consensus set of skills for the broad practice of public health as defined by the 10 essential public health services. They really reflect foundational skills desirable for professionals engaging in the practice, education, and research of public health. And it was designed to serve as a starting point, so not meant to be the be-all and end-all, but rather a starting point for both academic and practice organizations as they're working to better understand and meet training and other needs within the workforce. The core competencies are organized in two ways. First, they're organized into 8 domains, which represent skill areas within public health, and we've listed each of those on the slide here. They're also organized into 3 tiers. And these are more reflective of career stages. They're focused on the professional responsibilities of a professional within an organization. The core competencies are used by academic institutions, they're used by health departments, and a variety of other organizations. For example, data from the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials and the National Association of County and City Health Officials tell us that approximately 60% of state health departments and about 26% of local health departments are using the core competencies. In terms of academia, the last time we conducted the survey, the percentage was slightly more than 90%. We realize this data is getting a little bit dated at this point. We are planning to update this later this year. The core competencies are also used by CDC, particularly in developing discipline-specific competencies and in guiding their training and fellowship programs. HRSA, especially through the public health training centers. They're used in learning management systems for public health, such as TRAIN, and are also incorporated into 3 objectives within Healthy People 2020, 2 of which are maybe particularly relevant. There's one focused on increasing the proportion of CEF-accredited schools of public health, CEF-accredited academic programs, and schools of nursing that integrate the core competencies into their curricula, as well as an objective around increasing public health personnel who receive continuing education consistent with the core competencies. And finally here, the Public Health Accreditation Board, which is mentioned already, has a requirement for competency-based workforce development plans, and the core competencies are given as one example of a set of nationally adopted competencies. So in addition to being used by a variety of organizations, the core competencies are also used in a variety of ways, some of which you have probably gathered from the last slides. So job descriptions, performance objectives, which then feed into reviews and evaluations. They're used in competency assessments, needs assessments for the workforce, the development of workforce development plans and training plans. They're used in curriculum development, course development, and several of these you'll hear in a few moments more about examples of these types of activities. They're also used in discipline-specific competencies as the foundation and in preparing for accreditation. The 2014 version of the core competencies was released last summer following a unanimous vote by the Council on Linkages to adopt that version. This is actually the 3rd version of the core competencies. They were originally developed in 2001 and in fact grew out of an even earlier set of universal competencies which date from 1991. The core competencies since 2001 have been revised twice, once in 2010 and then, as I said, again last year. And the revision of the core competencies is quite an extensive process. It took us about a year the last time around and really involved engagement from a wide variety of people within the public health community. So all of the member organizations of the Council on Linkages. We have a core competencies work group which has about 55 members, both from academia and practice, and a variety of other professionals and organizations were involved as we really collected a lot of feedback from the field in order to guide the revision. So getting into what some of that feedback was, we did receive over 1,000 comments on the core competencies, and these bullets just hit on some of the major elements that we saw or that we heard from the public health community. So first we were asked to retain the 8 domains, keep the structure, not to change it significantly as we went through the revision process, but to really focus in on clarifying and simplifying the individual competencies. We got a lot of feedback that the language can be difficult to understand. And along with this, as Kathy mentioned, to ensure that each competency really is only one competency. We were asked to add new concepts, particularly related to health reform and accreditation, add some more examples, and to look at reordering the competencies within the domains, but not to move competencies from one domain to another. In addition, we were asked to consider adding another tier. This came up a lot in relation to clerical and support staff, and then to help people with their use of the core competencies. So what did we do? So we spent a lot of time working on this to really address these needs. We did add more examples in the form of EGs. We reduced jargon, we added new concepts, we expanded on existing concepts, and most of all we focused on clarifying and simplifying the language. So we just wanted to share with you one example of this to illustrate how big a difference this can make. So for example, in 2010, we had a competency that read applies communication and group dynamic strategies, e.g. principled negotiation, conflict resolution, active listening, risk communication in interactions with individuals and groups. In 2014, as you could see, this became facilitates communication among individuals, groups, and organizations. So you can see it's the same core concept, but it's presented very differently, and we hope that will make a difference in how people use their competencies. A few other decisions that we made. So we did keep the 8 domains, both the number and the topic areas remain the same. We reordered individual competencies within the domains, but did not move any competencies from one domain to another. We did focus looking at ensuring that each competency was only one competency. And the idea of developing an additional tier is something that's still under discussion with the Council on Linkages. So we decided to revise the existing tiers first and then come back to that idea. Tools are now being updated and developed to both help with the transition to the revised version of the competencies and also to help with use of the core competencies. So just to highlight a few examples here, one of the first tools that we developed after the release of the revised version is a crosswalk, which shows the relationships between the individual competencies in the 2010 and the 2014 versions. We also updated a set of self-assessment instruments that already existed on our website to reflect the new language. We're focusing on building job descriptions, collections of job descriptions, and workforce development plans that incorporate the core competencies, and are always interested in highlighting good examples of how organizations are using the core competencies. In terms of the future, we're looking to revise a competency prioritization tool that we have. We're working on a competency checklist for course providers that will help with loading courses into learning management systems. We're working on a set of frequently asked questions, compiling popular questions and making the answers available online. And we're always interested in new suggestions. And so with that, I will close with just a couple of resources further information. We do have lots of information about the core competencies on the Public Health Foundation's website if you're interested in learning more. We also have a monthly newsletter, the Council on Linkages Update, which regularly includes the, what's new with the core competencies information. If you're interested in that, just send Janelle a quick email and she'd be happy to add you to the list. And I also am happy to answer questions at any time, either later during the webinar, after the webinar, or in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen. We do have one question for you at the moment, and we'll address the rest at the end. But for now, how do you determine what tools or examples are developed or provided? And if I'm using the core competencies, how can I share my experience with others?
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. So a lot of the tools and examples that we share through our website are really driven by feedback, by what we hear from the public health community. So as I mentioned, we're always interested in hearing your suggestions. We got lots of feedback as we went through the revision process, but we're always, interested in hearing more. If you have a suggestion or something you're working on that you'd like to share, all you have to do is email me. We'd be really happy to hear from you. And we have a variety of options in terms of how we can make things available through our website, sort of depending on what it is. Like if it's a tool, we can consider whether we can incorporate it into one of the resources we have on our website. If you have an experience that you'd be interested in sharing, We could look at writing something up either through our Examples of Use webpage or on our blog. But yeah, we really love to be able to highlight the good work that's happening out in the field and think of connections and ways to make it more available to the public health community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, and now we'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Marita Merman.
Thank you, Sarah. My presentation, titled Using Competencies, Council of Linkages, and Others in Developing Curricula in the Academic Setting, is based on my experience as chair of the Mailman School of Public Health's Curriculum Committee over the last number of years. The process our curriculum committee uses for faculty to design new courses and receive formal approval involves recommending the faculty member meets with their department, curriculum committee, or coordinator to discuss the need for the course related to the department's stated competencies, and that the new course won't duplicate an existing course. The faculty member then completes both the school's course proposal form and the course template, which I will review in the next number of slides. The faculty member then submits the completed form and course template to the curriculum committee's administrative coordinator for distribution to the committee members and review at the next scheduled curriculum committee meeting. At the next curriculum committee meeting, the faculty member provides background information about the course and responds to questions and/or concerns from committee members. The curriculum committee then approves the course for further processing or requests that the faculty member makes changes to the form or template and then resubmits the material for a second review. The following slides show select pages from the Mailman's course proposal form. On this slide, I'd like to draw your attention to two of the sections of the form requiring the faculty member specify which department or certificate program competencies the new course will address, and then list the new course learning objectives that relate to the previously specified competencies. I'll now provide you with one example of how one of our newly approved courses addressed one of the newly revised Council on Linkages core competencies. Under the domain of communication skills within Tier 2, which is the typical level we use for MPH students, the new course will address the competency of an MPH graduate being able to assess the literacy level of populations served. Returning to the previous page of the course proposal form, you'll now see the list of competencies for the certificate in health promotion, research, and practice. These competencies are taken directly from another competency set, specifying responsibilities and competencies for health education specialists developed by the National Commission of Health Education Credentialing. Under the major responsibility of communicate and advocate for health and health promotion, you'll see the previously highlighted Council on Linkages competency, assess the literacy level of populations served. In the next section on this page are the listed learning objectives related to assessing the literacy level of population served for the new course. On the next page of the course proposal form, you'll see the section which requires the faculty member to insert the description of the course, which should incorporate the course competencies, learning objectives, teaching methods, and assessment procedures for the new course. Section 8 of the form requires the faculty member to complete the required course template, including, in particular, course learning objectives and a course description, as already described, and assessment procedures for ensuring that course competencies and related learning objectives are assessed by the end of the course. On this slide, you'll see 2 pages from the required course template, the template used by faculty to develop their course syllabi. Here, I'll draw your attention first to the course title, which should clearly relate to the course description, and the course description should address the course competencies, learning objectives, teaching and learning methods, and assessment procedures. In the last section of pages from the course syllabus that I have chosen to show you, on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the various assessment procedures this faculty member designed to ensure that she can measure the extent to which students have achieved the specified course competencies and learning objectives by the end of the course. For example, for the 3rd assignment, students are required to select an existing communication campaign. These campaigns typically come out of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and then assess all aspects of literacy as the student critiques this campaign, and so on. Another example of trying to assess achievement of learning objectives listed earlier can be seen in the final assignment for the course, where students are required to identify a brochure, a form, a website, and improve the material to better serve a low literacy audience. Over the course of the last semester, the Mailman School of Public Health's Curriculum Committee has used the process I have briefly described to incorporate the revised Council of Linkages core competencies and other competency sets into newly proposed courses. We reviewed 11 new course proposals, approved 9, and rejected 1. 2 of these courses were at the introductory level, 8 were at the intermediate level, typically requiring 1 or 2 prerequisite courses, and none were at the advanced or doctoral level. Thank you. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to our next speaker, Jennifer Kolker. Jennifer?
Actually, before we turn it over, we do have one question for you before moving on.
Oh, sure.
How easy have you found it to get faculty to comply with the information your curriculum committee requires, especially related to identifying particular competencies and related learning objectives?
May I mute my line so I can giggle a little bit? This has, to be honest, this has not been an easy process. It's been slow. It's an evolving process. We're really fortunate to have a curriculum development expert at the school. She's been here for a number of years, has really developed a lot of trust from the faculty. And what commonly happens is the administrative coordinator for the curriculum committee is in routine contact with each of the department coordinators and asks them if they have plans for any new course proposals to be submitted. If they indicate they do, then the coordinator is encouraged strongly to have the faculty member set up a meeting with the curriculum design expert, and then essentially she talks to the faculty member, and after their conversation she'll draft an initial, they'll together identify specific competencies from that faculty member's department that they want to address. They then will have a conversation. Basically, at the end of that conversation, the curriculum development expert will draft initial learning objectives, send them to the faculty member, they'll review them, send them back, and it's an ongoing process. You'll notice with some of the examples that I provided for learning objectives, and those are actual learning objectives, they don't entirely conform to the competency structure that Kathy provided earlier. So it's again an ongoing process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merman. And now we will turn it over to the next speaker, Jennifer Kolker. Jennifer?
Thank you. So I'm going to talk now about what we do when we use competencies in developing trainings for the public health workforce. And I want to start by going back to the beginning a little bit and talking about what does it mean to be competent. We talk about competencies, but what do we mean by being competent? So pulling out some standard dictionary definitions, having the necessary ability, knowledge, or skill to do something successfully, being efficient and capable, being acceptable and satisfactory, though not outstanding, which I thought was somewhat funny. And really to drive the point home that what we're looking to do here is to give people, whether it's in a classroom or in this case in the practice world, the ability and the knowledge and skills to do something successfully. And in the workforce, that means to perform their job function effectively to improve public health. Next slide, please. So again, to restate what we heard earlier, the Council on Linkages core competencies, which are really the guiding competencies for the workforce, a set of skills desirable for the broad practice of public health, characteristics that staff of public health organizations may want to possess, and again, most importantly, they are a starting point for practice and academic organizations to understand and assess and meet training and workforce needs. They're not an endpoint. They're the place, though, I think, where academia and public health practice can really come together and begin to have a shared understanding of what the workforce does and what we can do in terms of providing training and workforce development to help the practice community do what they need to do. So the first way that we use competencies is to determine training needs. Competencies are used to develop the framework for assessing training needs through formal and informal needs assessments. And in a moment, I'll share with you some examples of some formal training needs assessments we've done here in Philadelphia. Training needs assessments help employers identify strengths and gaps in their workforce by measuring their employees' skills and knowledge against the competencies and against what the job requires. And similarly, training needs assessments enable employees to reflect upon what they do and whether or not they have all the skills and knowledge they need or want to do their jobs and what else they might want to do to learn. So one of the most important ways I think that we use these competencies is this concept of developing a common language. So it's important to remember that the workforce does not always use the language of the Council on Linkages competencies. Your average person who might be doing disease surveillance or working in maternal child health or doing something else in whether it's a small county health department or a large city health department, they're not necessarily rattling off the Council on Linkages competencies. But development and delivery of training is a real opportunity to develop a language to disseminate the competencies to the workforce so that we can begin to start thinking and talking in the same way so that we know what we mean when we're developing trainings and the workforce knows what it means when they talk about doing the job function and how to do it competently. So here's one example of this was a formal electronic workforce needs assessment that we used with a local health department as part of their preparation for FAB accreditation. We heard earlier that this is a requirement of FAB accreditation that health departments assess the skills of their workforce. So this is just some example of some of the things that we found. Tier 1 employees in this particular division had low or no proficiency in certain areas, financial planning and management, public health sciences, and leadership thinking skills. The major gap from the Tier 2 self-reports was in the area of financial planning and management skills. Staff had a wide range of training interests: public health data, evidence practice, quality improvement, communications, Microsoft Project, and informatics. And based on this combination of self-assessment, employee assessment, there were some other recommended trainings that would cover skill sets specific to employees' daily activities involving financial planning and using research. In a second division, again, this is a large city health department, so the second division, again, supervisors of Tier 1 employees. So we administered this both to the employees themselves, but also to supervisors of those employees to get a sense of what their take was on what the gaps were in their workforce. They indicated low confidence in certain areas: analytical assessment skills, policy development, financial planning, and some particular issues around ethical principles and data information, and very importantly, to the ability to recognize relationships that affect health in a community, which is something you would want all of your local health department staff to know. In the same division, Tier 2 staff reported gaps in leadership and systems thinking, financial planning and management, again, and public health sciences. So respondents also expressed interest in trainings on surveillance use and practices, as well as supervisor training for senior staff. And what's really interesting is that results from the needs assessment showed that a clear need for training in research and ethics and issues in community health and communication, though that wasn't necessarily put forth as a need by employees themselves. We'll talk a little bit later about how you kind of manage that gap between what somebody may need to be competent and what their own assessment is of their competency in a particular area. So once you do a training needs assessment, and again, it could be the way I just described, which is a very formal needs assessment, but there are other ways of doing that kind of needs assessment that may be more informal depending on the type of workforce that you're working with. Once you do that, you need to use the results of your needs assessment to develop a training plan. Once you have a roadmap for training content, you can determine which competencies you'll focus on and how you use training to increase the competency of your audience. Remembering, again, that competencies are a starting point. You are increasing the competency. You're not necessarily going to make somebody wholly expert in a particular area. By using the competencies, training can be developed that can meet a specific area of a skill need or a range of skills and knowledge identified as a gap. And again, sometimes the training needs for the job function and what employees want to learn don't match. And it's up to the person and those of us in academia developing these trainings and working with the workforce to figure out how to make that work and how to bridge the gap between those two things. You need to decide if a training is going to be broad and shallow, obviously, or narrow and deep. And as Kathy Miner said earlier, we need to be able to measure it, whatever it is that you're doing in that particular training. And it's really important to think about training as a process and not a single event. Competencies really provide a path for sequencing of training and building skills. And you have to remember, again, that competence is achieved over time, and expertise takes even longer. And I will say, as somebody who's been doing this workforce training for some time and through the Public Health Training Center program, it's getting harder and harder to do that in some ways. There's been more of an emphasis, I think, on kind of one-and-done trainings. Let's train the most number of people on the most number of things. And it can be a challenge to provide depth of skill development and increased competency over time. So I think we really have a challenge ahead of us to think about how we build training so that people achieve different levels of competency over time and really increase their knowledge and increase what they're able to do. Remembering that competency is the immediate goal, but expertise is really the longer vision when we think about the public health workforce. So some tips and traps. Again, using the competencies to develop a common language, remembering that the workforce, their job is to do what they do and not necessarily to think about the language which they do it. So it's really the responsibility of those of us who are developing trainings to listen and to listen carefully to what people do and for us to then figure out where within the competencies those fit. Sometimes the competence is there, but the language is different, and if you miss that, then you're off to a bad start. It's also important to spend time thinking about those tiers. Often they don't people's jobs don't fit neatly into one of the tiers. There can be overlap depending on the size and the capacity of the workforce. I was really pleased to hear that Council Linkages is thinking about going back and maybe adding tiers, and maybe that's something that the next round will look at. So it's important to tease out what actual job functions and responsibilities are and adapt that as necessary. And again, as Kathleen said earlier, all of these things are adaptable. These are not, they're not written in stone. So you have to kind of take these, look at the tiers, and maybe frame them around different job functions and different ways that organizations are organized and how their infrastructure is. As with all trainings, it's important to keep it real. You can't rely just on theoretical language of the competency itself when you're dealing with the workforce. It's really important to tie competencies to actual examples and job functions, using case studies, using role plays where possible. And finally, what I think is really important is what sometimes appears as a lack of competence in the workforce, either within an individual or within a unit or within a health department, is often a lack of capacity in the workplace. So sometimes we need to look at really carefully at what job descriptions are, what job functions are, and it's important, again, to be creative and respectful as we work with our audience in developing training needs and assessing competencies to see what the real story is, so that what we develop and give them is going to meet their needs and, again, improve the competency of the workforce.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And then we do have a question, and has asked you to expand upon your comment relating to what you do when the content people want to learn doesn't exactly match the competencies that they need to do their jobs.
That's a great question. I think it's something as a professor, I deal with that in academia all the time. What I teach is not always what my students want to learn. So I think, again, I think you can't do any job well if you're not happy. And so I think it's really important to not only give the workforce the training that they need for the skills for the job they have right then, but it's also important to be responsive to things that they might want to learn. And we do that for a few reasons, because people change jobs. So somebody might be in disease surveillance now, but really have a keen eye toward their professional development, and they want to move into grant writing, and they might want to learn something about grant writing and communications now, even though they don't need to know that for their current job. So I think it's important really to work with supervisors and management when you're doing these types of training to give people the training that they need to do the job they have right now and do it well, but also to give people ultimately an enthusiasm for their job, an enthusiasm for learning, and a real love of public health. Because if they have that, then no matter what they're doing in their job, I personally believe they will be more competent.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now we'll turn it back over to Dr. Kathleen Meyer to finish up.
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm a bookend on both sides. What I want to do is talk about accountability and competencies. And the way to do that is to think about the aspirational thing about accreditation. So could I have the next slide, please? A lot of times we worry about, so how do we get acknowledged for using competencies and get the credit for doing some work, or that we're required to do by virtue of where we work and get the notability and or the requirements to ensure that wherever we work we're acknowledged for it, or we're required to do it because it seems to be the right thing to do, access to resources or students, or sometimes it's the need to be part of the game or in the know. So first of all, let's start off that competencies are there to help describe the function of professionals, whether it's our profession or somebody else's profession. And the thing it's important to recognize that the use of public health competencies in our profession are equal in the practice world, the FAB world, if you wish, in terms of accreditation, and the academic world, the CEF, are similar. They're there for the same reason. The accreditation process is an assessment process. From the practice setting, the competencies assess the need for new and updated skills in the workforce, just as Jennifer described. And from the academic setting, competencies assess the relevance of the curriculum, and the readiness for learners to enter the workforce. So if you think of it from that way, what you're really talking about, aspirational work for the students, and sometimes, in fact, it's aspirational for the faculty who are teaching the students. And from the practice setting, it's making sure your skills of the workforce are up to date. And so what they are, in many ways, aspirational. So if you take a look at this, what you're really seeing in this little simple model here, you start off with a school or an agency that has a mission associated with it, that leads to curricular or training, that ends up producing courses. And these courses or training experiences are structured by the competencies we've talked about. And these competencies end up with objectives, and these objectives are either course objectives, whatever they are, still built on competencies that are broken down into, you might think of learning objectives, that increase the learner's assessments that we judge by, and it's a circle back and forth and back and forth. And let me just remind you of a few things that we've sort of touched on throughout the last 35 minutes or so. If you think about, from the workforce point of view, it's ensuring that your work that you do is of merit to the community. And that's why they're there. Now, sometimes it isn't exactly what you're doing at the moment, but it's making sure that you're doing what is expected of a professional. That's what professionals do. From a learner's point of view, in an academic setting, it's making sure that when you enter the workforce, your skills are up to date and you can perform the right kinds of things. So in both cases, it's aspirational. And it's the responsibility of a professional to do their work at the level that is expected of the community. That's what professionals do. And the competencies in both settings assure the highest performance possible. Now, do we always get there? Not so much. But do we aspire to it? I hope so. And that's why we have these structures called competencies. And I want to be able to make sure that we all, as professionals, us sitting here giving this webinar, and those of you who are listening to this webinar, recognize it's all our responsibilities to ensure that these competencies remain crisp and relevant. I want to remind us, though, that in the workforce there is, in the FAB side, you have 8.2 that reminds us that the workforce needs to be competency-based education. And in the CEEF side of it, which is the academic side, those of you, we have 2.6 and 2.7 that require competency-based educational programming. So we all are under the gun to make sure that the work that we do has the best kind of evidence that our students and or our trainees are well educated, and that the kind of work that we do is worthy of the kind of public health that we all care about. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sarah to whatever else that we're supposed to be doing next. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miner. We do have a burning question for you before we open the lines to questions for everyone. How do we, as in faculty, match the needs of the current workforce with the Council on Linkages competencies in training programs?
Would you mind repeating that again, please?
Oh, of course. How do we, as in faculty, match needs of the current workforce with the Council on Linkages competencies in training programs?
In training programs, or at the academic level, or in the academic world?
Just training in general, so I'm not sure what the submitter meant.
Well, let me answer it in both ways. As faculty, we have to know what the practice world is doing so that our curriculum in the academic center is relevant as well, so that academics who don't know what the practice world is doing, then we are in danger of producing courses within the academic setting that are producing learners not ready for graduating with the right kind of skill sets to go into practice. If you're talking about the kind of thing that Jennifer was talking about, then what's happening is you end up with offering the practice community training that isn't relevant for their own practice. In both cases, we're not doing the right professional practice ourselves as academics. So that's a problem. That's why the Council on Linkages competencies are important, because they are developing competencies relevant for the practice world. What is in danger we have is to make sure that those professional competencies, Council on Linkages, have to also be blended with those competencies that are associated with the depth of individual professional identities. For example, there are competencies for health education, there's competencies for epidemiologists, there's competencies for things like, I'm trying to think of other, nursing and those kind of things have to be blended with those that have specific professional identities, and they have to be blended together. And that's how you keep yourself making sure that you don't skip those things that are in depth with those that are more professionally wide competencies. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I open it up to my colleagues on the that are part of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miner. Now the lines are, please feel free to submit your questions via the question box, and we do have a few. The questions weren't directed toward anyone in particular, so any of the speakers, please feel free to unmute yourself and address the question if you feel that you would like to. The first question, what is offered via PHF's workforce development plans that you reference? Are they state-based, statewide, or do they include work plans for specific areas of public health, such as injury, violence, and prevention?
Thanks. The workforce development plans that we have on the PHF website right now are all examples of, well, I shouldn't say all, the vast majority of them are examples that have been submitted to the Public Health Accreditation Board. So they're sort of general workforce development plans. Most of them are local health departments. I think we have one Florida State Health Department plan. And the link in the slides that we use should all be live. So you should be able to go right to our website and take a look at them yourself. We're not actually creating the workforce development plans ourselves. We're just providing access to plans that organizations have submitted to us and said that we can make available to other people. Does that help?
I think so. Thank you. All right. There was a question about the slides being available. We will post these along with the archived recording on our website on the event page. Is there a meaningful distinction between learner outcomes and competencies? If so, what is the distinction, and how do competencies relate to the key outcomes for an academic program?
Well, this is Marita Merman. Kathy, I'll take a stab at this, and I'd like to turn it over to you. And my opinion, I've not really tried to draw a distinction between the two. To me, a fully developed, correctly written competency is essentially the same as a learner outcome. But Kathy, do you think differently?
No, they're very much the same. If you think of a competency, that is a uber level learning outcome, because what you can have is a competency broken down into learning objectives that can be much more specific. So you may have one competency with underneath it many objectives. So what you might get out of it, out of one competency, you may have 6 or 7 learner outcomes linked to that one competency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you very much. Thanks both of you for answering that question. Another one, where would you recommend to look at actual studies where the core competencies have been applied in a public health workforce?
This is Jennifer. I don't know of actual studies. I think that probably the best way to do it would be to ask around. I mean, I think certainly those health departments that are either in the process of accreditation or have gone through accreditation are probably pretty far ahead because they've had to, because of some of the external pressures on doing that, though plenty of other health departments who are not yet engaged in accreditation are also looking at competencies. So NACCHO might have some resources on that because they've been supporting the FAB process a great deal, but I would probably start with looking at those health departments and seeing what we can gather. More probably case studies than research studies that I'm aware of at this point.
This is Kathy again. A lot of professions have been using competency-based instruction and processes that are way ahead of the public health field. Nursing, pharmacy have been doing it for a long time. And the reason that they're ahead of us is their definition of their profession is much narrower than public health. And so they've been able to focus in a lot tighter than we have. Public health is so broad and includes nursing. So if you want more information about the actual measurement of competency-based education, it's quite well defined. Public health is a little behind the curve.
This is Kathleen. I just wanted to add, there is data in the NACCHO profile. It depends a little bit on what you're looking for. NACCHO, when they ask the questions about what competencies local health departments are using, they ask how. So are you using it for job descriptions, are you using it for performance evaluation, whatever. I don't believe the data is published in the latest version of the profile study, but I do know it exists because I've seen it. So if you contact NACCHO, I think they can share it with you. And other than that, I'm not sure in terms of formal studies. It's one of the reasons we try to capture people's stories, people's examples of how they're using them, so at least we get some discussion going.
Thank you all so much for all your answers to those questions. And there are several other questions that we are not going to get to today due to time constraints. So I apologize for that. But please feel free to follow up with the speakers, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you, Ms. Amos, Ms. Kolker, Dr. Miner, and Dr. Merman. And thank you to our participants, attendees of the webinar. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available along with the slides on the ASPPH website on the event page listing in the near future. And please be sure to either contact me at webinars@aspph.org or any of the speakers with additional questions. Also, please mark your calendars or stay on the lookout for future ASPPH Presents webinars. And lastly, we will be featuring a session related to competencies, including the Council on Linkages competencies at our annual meeting in March of this year. So we hope to see some of you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.